where you've worked for the IRS and then your eyes kind of got opened on certain things. You saw some, what I would call injustices going on. Is that a fair statement?
That's correct. About 3 years into my career there, I was listening to a talk radio station up in the San Francisco Bay Area, KSFO, still around. The talk show host had a guest on his show. The talk show host was Jeff Metcalf, and the guest was DV Kidd, Devvy, kind of an unusual first name. And Devvy was talking about the income tax, about the Federal Reserve, about all kinds of topics. But she claimed that the income tax was largely a voluntary system in that there were no mandates for the average American to be required to tax return or pay the income tax. And so if you can imagine me driving around in my government car with my Sig Sauer 9mm on my hip and here's this woman on the radio, how can you say such a thing?
Yeah.
The income tax isn't required to be paid by most Americans. I mean, I don't know what you're talking about. But the talk show hosts, like you and Jesse, tell so much truth that when something comes across your ears that seems odd, but the people that are telling you have told you the truth every other time, it makes you, scratch your head and say, well, I got to look into this. So wow, that's what I did, especially given that I had taken an oath to support and defend the Constitution, had the ethics of a CPA. I was a CPA at the time, and they have ethical requirements. So I felt I had a duty, really an obligation to look into these claims. If anything, then I was easily duped because I believed this talk show host and his guests, and maybe he wasn't such a truth teller, right? Yeah. Because he has this woman talking about the income tax in that manner. So I began a 2-year off-duty, days off, evenings, driving my wife crazy. My two 30-something-year-old sons were very young at the time, because this is like almost 25 years ago. And I just began to do fact-finding, use the skills that the IRS had taught me as far as research skills, all the skills you have to develop to be a certified public accountant. And I just began to poke at this claim that the IRS was lying to the public about their income tax obligations. And so for a 2-year period, I poked at it, and I did it on my own time, so it wasn't some kind of an official investigation. The taxpayer didn't have to pay for my time. I was doing it completely on my own as a concerned citizen, and of course a federal employee who believed he had an obligation, a constitutional duty to get to the bottom of it. So at the end of that 2 years, this would have been throughout 1997 and 1998, the 4th and 5th years of my work there. I was very skeptical, of course, because when somebody tells you, most Americans aren't liable for the federal income tax, they're not required to pay it, it sounds pretty crazy.
Yeah, you think?
And so, that was kind of how I approached it, but, as open a mind as I could muster.
Well, what did you find?
At the end of that 2 years, I found that the IRS was absolutely lying to the public. Wow. They were the complicit mainstream media, Congress people that are either, in the pocket of the special interests or dumbed down so much they don't care. And basically just a system, a status quo that had existed since 1913 when the 16th Amendment was allegedly ratified, but basically found mountains of evidence indicting the IRS on lying to the American people about their income tax obligations.
Wow, this is incredible because for you to do this, now I can understand it while you were figuring all this out, working for the IRS, there'd be a conflict here.
An extreme conflict.
Yeah,
I mean,
go ahead.
No saint by any means, but I was a devout, practicing Catholic, had been throughout most of my life, and never, lost my faith in college. Or
Good.
I certainly became more educated about my faith and informed my conscience better, thanks to
Yes.
people like Terry and Jesse. But certainly by the time I was in my 30s, when I worked at the IRS, I was well aware of what it meant to steal, whether it's a penny or a dollar or $10 million. And to bear false witness in terms of a tiniest little, white lie versus a, gargantuan lie. I knew what was right and what was wrong. And so I was really torn because I had taken an oath, which I was very conscious of. The oath was administered to me by myself. Usually they'll have, 20, 30, 50 agents in a room and say, okay, raise your hand. And it's a very perfunctory process. But in my case, it was just me. My wife was there, my mom, my youngest brother, and just very meaningful. And of course, expected to honor that oath every day of my career. Didn't realize, though, that I'd have to honor it in that manner.
Wow. And now continue, Joe, because this is where it gets very interesting, because you really had to make a decision whether you were going to act on your conscience or just keep it quiet.
That's correct. So, as I mentioned earlier, every federal employee is required to take an oath to support and defend the Constitution.
Right.
And there's also Treasury rules of conduct that dictate to every employee even more than, or say deeper than the oath to support and defend the Constitution. They actually lay out, I would say it's akin to the Catholic Catechism, right, versus the Ten Commandments. I shouldn't say versus, but the Catechism goes into explicit detail so that it can really guide you in more minute things that we all run into every day of our lives.
Right.
Well, same with the Treasury rules of conduct. They have examples. They really go into detail about, helping you determine what is right and what is wrong in your daily duties. So anyway, everyone that I approached, my immediate supervisor, the chief, who generally they're called now special agents in charge, the entire office, I approached them with my concerns, and they took the same oath to support and defend the Constitution that I did. Most of them were Catholic, Christian, so they had another layer of moral obligation.
Yep.
So I realized that this information or preliminary conclusions that I arrived at were going to be difficult for them to swallow. But again, they were difficult for me to swallow. So, but I have obligations
right.
to the people and to the oath. So I approached them. I let them know, look, I've gone to bat for the agency, the income tax, the status quo.
Right.
My whole professional life has been wrapped up around it. So I'm not trying to make any trouble here, but I've come across some very disturbing facts.
Sure.
And, we're all criminal investigators here. So we know facts are what dictate, we present those facts to a prosecutor and they decide whether to prosecute or let the person go and not prosecute. So I felt like, as bad a taste as it might leave, like we all had a duty to listen, to talk, to express. And so that's what I did. I approached them. I wrote up a report that gave some of the highlights of what I had encountered over those 2 years. Nothing that I came up with on my own. It was more just poking at existing evidence that I wasn't previously aware of.
Wow.
They never taught me that at San Jose State University or on the CPA exam. I had to dig deeper, but I was digging into statutes, regulations, Supreme Court case law, that kind of thing.
Well, just jumping in, what convinced you that this income tax, in America that everybody's paying is not just unjust, but this is a bold statement to say, Joe, we get your seatbelt on, everybody, that you don't even think it's illegitimate at this point in the evidence. You worked for the IRS, but it's not legitimate for us to be paying the taxes we're paying to the IRS, and that can get you in a lot of hot water if that's your position, which I think it is.
It is my position,
Yeah.
and of course, I'm kind of fast forwarding, but in terms of
You are.
How I discuss this with my own family, with
Yes.
friends, with anyone I encounter that I don't even know from Adam. It's very. I'm not some cheerleader or Pied Piper urging and prodding people to get into a battle with the IRS or to change their conduct in terms of filing and filing tax returns and paying the income tax. None whatsoever. That isn't my intent whatsoever. It's simply that I, did the job where I was literally investigating people to put them in prison.
Wow.
Of course, that would be after a jury heard their defense, right? And if beyond a reasonable doubt the prosecutor proves that they committed the criminal offense, then they're going to be punished with some kind of jail term. So we're not talking about the gulags of Cuba or the USSR,
Sure.
but nevertheless, I felt I had like an extra duty to not be prodding people along. Well, first of all, I had a duty to determine what the truth was early on, but then as far as discussing this matter with people after the fact, after I left the IRS, always very calm about it and not prodding people whatsoever. If anything, I'm actually discouraging them from changing their conduct at all, except to read some facts, become a more informed juror if you're ever called to jury duty, maybe write a letter to your congressman, maybe tell a friend or neighbor. But if you think you're going to talk to somebody who's going to say, well, if this is a scam, I'm going to stop doing everything right now, I always counsel against that, because the learning curve, as with the Catholic faith, right? It's steep.
That's right.
It's a hill you should climb. Of course, with the faith, it's a must climb. But I would urge my fellow citizens to just look at the facts